This is what you're waking up to in terms of your biggest economic headlines today. Now, the High Court wants the National Treasury to respond to a petition filed by two rights activists on grounds that the 2021-2022 national budget was unconstitutional. Justice James Magao on Wednesday directed Treasury, Attorney General and Parliament to respond within 7 days so that the case can be settled for a hearing, with the judge assigning the case to be mentioned on June 29th, 2021. Now, the two activists, Okiom Tata and Wanjeri Derry, argue that the budget went off the limit set by Parliament by 608.85 billion shillings, set at 3.023 trillion, adding that it also violates the requirement for development component of the budget, which is supposed to be at least 30% of the total. Now, the activists say that the budget violated the requirement that the deficit should not be more than the development component, arguing that the recommendations of the budget policy statement 2021-2022 was supposed to form the basis for finalization of the national budget under Section 25(8) of the Public Finance Management Act, Public Finance Regulation Act, Section 24(7), and Standing Order, Section 232, Cap 10. Wow. All right. This morning, let's look at the data that we have for you this morning under this specific area, which if you can just put it up. Yes, that's the government recurrent expenditure. You can see exactly where we are from 2015 all the way to 2020, 2021. And indeed, it has been rising. That's the general trend. Albeit that shortfall in 2020, 2021, sort of highlighting the austerity measures that the Treasury was supposed to, sort of got into to sort of cap that recurring expenditure. Let's move on to the next part this morning. Again, in terms of government recurring expenditure, that can be crossover. Richie, if you can. Good. Once we have that data, we shall be giving it to you. Seems like we don't have it again this morning. All right. Helping us to go through the major headlines this morning, we are joined by George MUNGA and SHAH. George, let me begin with you, sir. Good morning.
Morning, Elijah. Morning. How are you doing?
Happy to have you around, George. We are fine. George, it's not the it's not the first time that we look back and then say that, well, the government budget is unconstitutional. In fact, this is the second time that we have this sort of concern from some members of the economy. What we read into this, George?
Elijah, our budget making process is one of the key components in the 2010 Constitution.
Yes,
and it is captured in the Public Finance Management Act, which clearly states how the budget making process ought to be. It starts from Parliament with the Budget and Appropriations Committee as a committee of the House, in liaison with Treasury, and during that period there should be public participation, Elijah. That is what the PFM Act requires.
Yes.
And by the time it is being read out by the minister, it should have gone through all those processes that the PFM Act envisages. If you look at our 2021-2022 budget, of course, there were loopholes here and there that the activists have pointed out. One is that there is a ceiling, or there is a cap that Parliament puts in place, and that was 3.023 trillion as captured.
Yes.
And then there is the minimum amount that must go into development expenditure, and that must be 30%. But remember, Elijah, I want to look at this as administrative issues,
yes,
rather than constitutional issues.
Yes.
If this was to be the case, then I presume that Treasury would go back to their numbers and just recalibrate or reconfigure their numbers to take into account what the constitution requires. But that notwithstanding, I think what the activists are raising is genuine concerns that ought to be addressed. As to the validity of this case, I think that we will wait for the courts to tell us. But I don't think that the courts can nullify or can stay such an important aspect of our economy, or such an important activity in our economy as to stay the budget. Maybe they can just recommend what ought to be done in the next cycle of budgeting. But this is a pointer to Treasury, Elijah.
Yes.
That in as much as they want to put up these figures out there, these figures must be in tandem with the 2010 Constitution, and more specifically, the Public Finance Management Act. That has to go down to Treasury very clearly, without any doubt. But I think, as it is today, I don't think the activists have grounds, yes, but I don't think the courts will find it necessary to stay this budget and take us back to a new budget making process. Because remember, the PFM Act also stipulates the time frames for the budget making. It has to be done by the end of month of June, yes, so that we roll over the new budget as we go into the new financial year, Elijah.
Pretty much. So, George, are you saying, just before I bring in a said this morning, are you saying that the budget 2021 or 2022 was not constitutional, or was it constitutional for anybody listening to you?
Largely, it is largely constitutional, Elijah. But according to the PFM Act, there are loopholes, as pointed out by the activists. One is that the development expenditure must be not less than 30%. If you look at our development expenditure, when we were discussing the budget process the last time we were with you, yes, I think it is around 18% of our total budget expenditure. And then two, that I think is frivolous, Elijah, if you're to ask me.
Yes.
It is Parliament that sets the ceiling on the budget. And remember, the Budgetary and Appropriations Committee work in tandem with now the bigger house to set this ceiling. So if that missed Parliament, then I think that we cannot throw that back to Treasury, but Parliament must deal with that. They can still have a sitting and raise this ceiling to maybe the value that they think is appropriate for this country. But let me just delve further, Elijah. Remember, a bigger chunk or a bigger percentage of our budget is going into our debt financing, and that tells you why we have not allocated so much into development expenditure. So largely, the budget making process, if I was to put it, a bigger percentage is constitutional, but of course there are areas that are pointed out that are unconstitutional, yes, and that must be addressed probably now, or if not now, then in the next cycle of our budget making process.
Pretty much. Sid, let me bring you in on that as well. I mean, Sid, they mention very critical points. They say that the activists say that the budget violated the requirement that the deficit should not be more than the recommendations of the budget policy statement for 2021-2022. And that is pursuant to Section 25, Cap 8 of the Public Finance Management Act and the Public Finance Regulation 27, Cap 4, and Standing Order 232, Cap 10. They have a point. So, Sid, constitutional and constitutional.
Morning, Simba. Thanks for hosting the show. It's been a while since I've been on. Let me tackle your question from the laws you've just quoted.
Yes.
Let's see what Section 25 of the Public Finance Management Act provides for. It clearly states that the National Treasury is supposed to prepare and submit first to the Cabinet the budget policy statement for approval. Once the budget statement policy has been approved by Cabinet, it's tabled in Parliament, and this is supposed to be done by the 15th of February each year. In the budget policy statement, Section 25 provides that the National Treasury is supposed to include a statement on the proposed expenditure limit, limited for national government, including those of the Parliament and Judiciary. And this is where the whole controversy the activist application is premised on. It goes on to also state that Parliament is within 14 days of the budget policy statement being tabled in Parliament. Parliament is required to discuss a report containing its recommendations, and they either pass a resolution to adopt the budget policy statement with or without proposed amendments. And then it goes on to finally provide that the Cabinet Secretary should take into account the resolutions passed by Parliament in finalizing the budget. If we go on to see what the public finance management regulations provide for, Regulation 27 provides that once the budget policy statement is adopted by Parliament, it's supposed to serve as the basis of expenditure ceilings specified within that fiscal framework and relevant for that financial year. So if we look at this, just based off the law, there is argument that there's some certain provisions of the Public Finance Management Act and the steps involved in creating, formulating, and passing the budget have not been followed. However, Section 16 also of the Public Finance Management Act provides for the national government, upon seeking approval of Parliament, to deviate from any financial objectives set in a budget policy statement. And this can only be done in situations where there's this temporary deviation can only be done in situations where it's necessitated by a major natural disaster or any other unforeseen, significant unforeseen event.
Yes.
So one could easily argue that the National Treasury does have a defense to justify its basis of deviating from the expenditure limits set in the budget policy statement. But on the issue of constitutionality or unconstitutionality of the budget, unfortunately, I'll have to reserve my comments. It's a matter in court, and let's wait for the 29th of this month when the High Court is going to be hearing the petition.
Pretty much.
Let's not predict what the courts are going to say, but let's sit back and wait. And I agree with what George had said.
Yes.
Even if there's been a violation of the law, it's highly unlikely for the court to stop this F21, F22 budget from proceeding.
Yes.
Just based on what we've seen previous judgments, not on budget, but for example, if you would allow me just to use the example of the recent ruling whereby cabinet secretaries and permanent CASs were deemed to be unconstitutional in office, and court went ahead and actually gave it that they stayed their own ruling until such a time when COVID-19 would be no longer an issue in our country. So just based on how the judiciary has interpreted previous major constitutional issues, it is unlikely for the F21-22 budget to proceed.
Yes. George, let's go back to exactly what they did. Again, it was in last year's budget as well, where there was a lot of conversation about the budget making process, which a lot of people said was not really that constitutional. George, we are a position, and I'm not talking about now this case that is in court, because we should not preempt on exactly what they're going to do. The powers of the court in making sure that the budget making process is actually constitutional. Can it be reversed? Not essentially saying go back and start again, but can it be reversed? And George, I want you to speak from this perspective of us going beyond what the Budget Policy Committee is recommending to Treasury to do. Yes, there are sections within that as well that provide for us to sort of go beyond what they're recommending. But how unprecedented were those conditions, George? We knew them when we're starting the process in February.
Budget making process is very sensitive, as it were.
Yes.
And in fact, even the framers of our constitution, especially on the Public Finance Management Act section, had envisaged this, that our budget making process is one of the key components in our governance. And that is why they put limitations, so they put recommendations on what ought to be considered in the budget making process.
Yes.
But still, again, Elijah, if you read the entire PFM Act, as it were, you realize that the framers of the Constitution knew that budgets are dynamic. There are things that will happen this year that you had not foreseen last year.
Yes.
An example is the COVID-19 pandemic that came in last year. If you are doing, say, a blueprint, like for example the Vision 2030, then you realize that there are things that you might not have foreseen in your forecasting that are realities today.
Yes.
That is why the PFM Act gives leeway to Parliament to make these legislations to support the current situation, as it were. So on this one, Elijah, I would want to push it back to Parliament.
Yes.
That maybe the Budget and Appropriation Committee is the one to be tasked with ensuring that our budget reflects our current situation as it is, but still abides by the Constitution. That's the PFM Act.
Yes,
the
George,
PFM Act is not
George,
very rigid, Elijah.
Yes, George, I'm sorry to cut you short, and I don't mean to this morning, but when you look at exactly what we made this budget, George, was it not under the COVID-19 pandemic? And these recommendations from the Budget Policy and Appropriations Committee, they were within the COVID-19 pandemic. So we knew very well on exactly what we had to do.
That is what I'm telling you, that this one has to, the bat lies with Parliament as it is,
yes.
and then with Treasury. That's what I'm trying to put.
Yes.
That Budgetary and Appropriations Committee probably did not interrogate some of these numbers and relay back the message to Treasury, so that they can harmonize whatever figures that Treasury had to align with the PFM Act,
yes.
but also take into account the current situation as it were, and also our debt financing. Remember, Elijah, in discussing the budget, we discussed this all the way from 2019, that our fiscal policies were not aligned to our current economic situations, and then our debt proposition.
Yes.
Our biggest challenge as it is today, Elijah, is our debt levels, or our debt portfolio. That is our biggest challenge. Remember, a bigger percentage of our finances or our revenues are going into debt financing. In fact, COVID-19 wouldn't have come at a worse time than the time it came. So I would still want to go back to Parliament and ask Budgets and Appropriations Committee to just relook at their figures, maybe in the next budgetary cycle.
Yes.
I want to agree with you that maybe courts will not find it necessary to overturn this budget as it were today, because if you do that, then basically you're telling government to shut down and wait for this process to be restarted. So I don't foresee a situation where the courts might put a stay on this budget. But that notwithstanding, I think the next budgetary cycle, the Parliament needs to sit down with the Treasury and just ensure that our budget reflects our current economic situations, but also must abide by the PFM Act and the 2010 Constitution, as it were.
Pretty much. Now, gentlemen, let's move on to the next one this morning. Now, the World Bank Group is now mulling removing Kenya from countries with a high risk of defaults on loans in a 2028 if the authorities can implement and strictly follow a program aimed at curtailing growth in government expenditure and punitive taxes. Now, the lender now says that it is optimistic that the country's debt risk profile will improve in coming years on economic growth and exports, helped by fiscal consolidation program and implementation of policy reforms. Now, the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, in the latest debt sustainability analysis (DSA) report in April, upheld Kenya's classification among its countries with high risk of debt distress. Let's look at that situation there for this morning with the data that we have for you, just to show you exactly where we are in terms of that. And you can actually see that Kenya's outstanding debt from IDA and IFAD, it has been rising despite their concern that we are a high risk debt country. Let's move on to where we are again on the next data set for you this morning, where we have Kenya's public debt. That's a known story, always rising, and we seem not to have a cap or contain it as well, despite the song and the preaching from the National Treasury as well. Let's cross over to the next data set that we have for you this morning. External debt as well, all the way up to where we are in January 2021, has been rising as well, sort of tallying with where we are in that Kenya's domestic debt as well, all the way to Q1 of 2021, always and has been on a rising trend. Sid, that should we implement reforms that would curtail national expenditure and reduction of taxes, then we could be out of those countries considered as high risk when it comes to debt. Now, for the question is, should the World Bank consider removing the country from high risk debt countries?
Yeah, Simba, before I answer that, let's just understand why we were put into that high risk benchmark.
Yes.
And this happened last year, May 2020.
Yes.
And the reason World Bank reclassified us from moderate rating to a higher rating was, because on the onset of COVID-19 containment measures the government had implemented, which generally hurt the economic activities in our country. Tax cuts led to depressed tax collections. Exports were cut significantly just because generally, for example, in the agricultural sector, European countries, many other first world countries, implementing measures to cut their imports, agricultural produce. We've had a delayed implementation of a fiscal consolidation program since a bit earlier than the COVID-19 pandemic. And all of this really led to a situation where I think World Bank reclassified their Kenya's rating from medium to high. And if we look at it now from a situation where we are in today in 2021, there is reason for us to be optimistic because our economy is on a bounce back. I mean, put it in those terms. World Bank has also predicted that our projected economic growth, our exports, and the fiscal consolidation program implemented as a result of the IMF and the World Bank program, this is going to lead to a spur in economic growth. And as a result of that, there is likeliness for us to be removed from that high rating to a more moderate rating. If you look at on a year-on-year basis,
yes,
output growth from last year, the second quarter of last year was at negative 5.5%. But if you look at the last quarter of 2020, it dropped down to negative 1.1%. But there is significant signs of economic growth. I mean, our economy is reopening. We are getting to tourism levels are obviously not going to be the same for a long time, but the tourism industry has reopened. So in terms of we should be optimistic enough to and hope for this economic growth to carry on in the right direction.
Yes.
And then when you look at this whole IMF World Bank program and the pressure that they've put on our national government to really cut down on their national expenditures, and one of the conditions of the grant was that that we were to carry out an audit of most of our parastatals, including Kenya Airways, Kenya Power, Kengen, and find a way to make sure we reverse some of these extraordinary measures introduced by the government and this extraordinary expenditure that was being taken in these corporations to help bounce them back. Hopefully, in that and then we have economic growth. They also contributed to buy these state-owned enterprises. So,
Yes.
I think the World Bank would be correct, and see it's not something in the short term. They've predicted this to be happening, by 2028. So if you look at it in a longer-term perspective, I would agree with World Bank, and we should in fact be removed from the high-risk debt list.
Yes. Pretty much.
In the long term by 2028.
Yes. All right, let's take a little break. But once we come back, George, I mean, when you look at it, it's heavily pegged on us taking reforms that are supposed to point us in the right trajectory. I like the optimism that has been shared this morning by Sid that if we look at it in the long term, yes, there could be signs that we could be moving in the right direction. But George, coming from the back end of Kenya, for the very first time, technically defaulting on our repayments because we've been heavy on those loan repayment negotiations through the DSSIs that we've been given. I mean, when you look at where we are, we have a budget that is the biggest one yet. Majority of that is going to back into loan repayments. Could we be considered to be among those countries that are not high risk debt countries even in 2028? Is it a problem that we can solve by policy, or one that we can solve by policy? Once we come back here on a Business AM, my name is Simba Elijah Charles Kiage. Join us online at Metropole TVKA.